So topic tonight, I'm calling it God's promise and covenant. We've been talking for a while now about, last week, we had several layers of God's promise to Abram. We're going to have several more layers of God's promise to Abram, but we're going to get the promise here at the beginning of chapter 15, and we're going to get the covenant at the end of chapter 15. So what are these layers of God's promise to Abram? Just a review of last week. In Genesis 12, God called Abram out of Haran. He said, "Come to a land I will show you." When he called him out of Haran, he gave him this layer of the promise. He says, "I'll make you a great nation." And he says, "All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you." Then when he got to Canaan, he had another run-in with God, and God said, "Look at all this land. I'm giving this land to your descendants." So he promised him descendants, and he promised him the land. At this point, Lot was still the presumptive heir. Abram probably thought that all of this is going to happen through Lot. But when God said that he promised him descendants, that's specifically saying that it's going to be his descendants. In other words, it's going to come through him. So he may have been getting the clue at that point that, this really may happen with me personally. But at this point, Lot may have still been the presumptive heir. So they go to Egypt to escape the famine. They're there for a little while. They come back. And Lot separates from Abram because of the run-in between their herdsmen. When Lot separates from Abram, he is no longer the presumptive heir. This is important because at the beginning of chapter 15, we're going to see what Abram is thinking about who his heir will be. It's no longer Lot. Chapter 13, God comes back to Abram after Lot separates, and he says, "I'm going to give the land to you and your descendants, and your descendants will number like the dust of the earth." So many descendants. So layers, different layers of a promise. Then we have the kings in chapter 14 that attack. Abram goes and chases them down and defeats them and brings back the people and the resources. And we get to then chapter 15, which is where we begin tonight. Verse 1 of chapter 15. "After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. 'Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward.' To which Abram replies, 'What you talking about, Willis?' "God, you said you were going to give me this land. I got no land. You said you were going to give me descendants. I got no heir.' At this point, Abram is probably in his 80s. His wife is in her 70s. And Abram says to God, "Eliezer of Damascus," this is someone who had been born in his group, in his household, a servant, not a physical descendant, but a servant in his house. "Eliezer is going to be my heir." Now, it was tradition back then that if you did not have an heir, you could essentially adopt someone from your household, in this case servants, and that person could become your heir. And so either this has already happened, or Abram is thinking that this is what he's going to need to do to make this happen. And God says, "Nah, bro, I still got this." Verse 4. "Now the word of the Lord came to him, 'This one will not be your heir. Instead, one who comes from your own body will be your heir.'" This is the next step in the multi-layer promise that God makes to Abram. We find out here for sure, no questions asked, that his heir and his descendants, all these promises are going to come from a descendant from Abram's own body. Then God says to Abram, he took him outside and he said, "Look at the sky and count the stars, if you are able to count them." This is not New York City. They did not have a golden haze in the sky. When he went outside and looked at the stars, he could see lots of stars. More stars than you can even see at my house, and you can see a pretty good number of stars at my house on a clear night, except for the trees. But he said, look at the stars. If you can count them, which you can't, that's how many descendants you're going to have. Verse 6, Abram believed the Lord, and he, God, credited Abram with righteousness. The verb here, believed. Abram believed. The word believed. The verb indicates ongoing activity. In other words, Abram continued to believe God. He believed God in chapter 12. He continued believing God in chapter 13. He continued believing God in chapter 14. And now in chapter 15, he is continuing to believe God. And God credited him with righteousness. The word credited comes from the world of accounting. In our terms, we would think about a bank account and money being deposited in a bank account. It's the same word that's used in the New Testament, reckon. And we've talked about that word before in the New Testament. God is putting a deposit in Abram's spiritual bank account, and that deposit is a deposit of righteousness. In other words, it is the actual state of affairs. And when you balance your checkbook, how much money do you actually have? You have whatever the bank says you have. Okay? It is the actual state of affairs. It's whatever God says you have is what you have. And God says that he had righteousness. And it was because of his continual belief in God. Amen? So we're making application here of the first part of Genesis 15, verses 1 through 6. And in verse 6, it says that God credited to Abram's account for righteousness when he believed in God. And so Paul makes much of this in particular, the letter to the Romans chapter 4. So our application here is for us to read Romans chapter 4, verses 16 to 25. And then we'll have a question based on that. So let's read that together. Romans chapter 4, beginning in verse 16. Therefore, it is of faith that it might be according to grace, so that the promise might be sure to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations, in the presence of him whom he believed, God, who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did, who contrary to hope in hope believed, so that he became the father of many nations, according to what was spoken, so shall your descendants be. Verse 19, and not being weak in faith, he did not consider his own body already dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. He did not waver at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully convinced that what he had promised him, he was also able to perform. And therefore, verse 22, it was accounted to him for righteousness. There Paul is quoting Genesis 15:6. Verse 23, now it was not written for his sake alone that it was imputed to him, but it was also written, verse 24, for us. It shall be imputed to us who believe in him who raised up Jesus our Lord from the dead, who was delivered up because of our offenses and was raised because of our justification. So the question we have is this. If this business about crediting righteousness for Abram's faith if that was written down in Genesis, not just for his sake, but also for our sakes, what is it that we are believing and what is it that we get credited with? Kurt, why don't you talk about that?
Well, I felt like the verses in Romans chapter 4 actually gave two things that we should be believing in. And the first is that God has the power to do what he has promised to do. Mm-hmm. So in other words, he can do whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And And then the second was that that we believe that Jesus died for our sins,
Yes.
and that God the Father raised Jesus from the dead,
Yes.
so that we can be justified
Mm-hmm.
through Jesus.
That's it. So we believe Abram didn't know who Jesus was, but he believed God in what he said at that time, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Now, we today, who have the hindsight and be able to believe in Jesus and what he did, that is who we are believing in. And so, Sam, you want to pick it up there? What else?
Yeah, listening to the actual thought of it was accredited to him, that accounting term. It kind of puts me in the mindset that, as people today, we do have the account, but obviously our account is in the negative. Sin and shame and just the whole gambit of things. But having the account and then choosing to place our faith in Jesus, Jesus takes what he died to pay for, his life and his death and his resurrection. He deposits into that account, takes us out of the negative, and presents us right before God.
Yeah.
All we have is faith. It's not a work, but it's a gift of God to see Jesus accredited to our account, salvation, faith in what he did.
Yeah, that's it. And you said it there at the end. He accredits to us salvation. So part of the question was, what is it that we're believing? We're believing in Jesus. The second part is, what is accredited to us? It's salvation. It's righteousness. So, Loretta, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think he did a marvelous job. I do think that for, say, someone my age, I have believed for 50 years, that Jesus died for me and that I am promised eternal life with the Lord. And like I say, I'm 80 years old. I'm still believing that I'm going to heaven because I believe in him, that it's counted as righteousness for me. I'm counted righteous.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's by faith.
Amen.
It's by faith. So, good. So I think we dealt with the question. So I hope you were blessed by that. Let's move on to the second look. All right. Well, I want you to pay attention, because we're going to get down into it now. I said that Genesis 15 was one of the three most important chapters in the Old Testament. I think that's true, although I could be argued out of it perhaps. But we want to continue now in Genesis with the back half of the chapter, which talks about the covenant. In the first part of the chapter, we had another layer of the promise. We've seen layers and layers of this promise that God is promising Abram these things, and we'll continue to see more and more layers of the promise. But right now, in the back half of Genesis 15, we see the covenant, which is a little different. In fact, it's quite a bit different. First of all, how do we know that it's a covenant? Because in the end of the chapter, beginning in verse 18, it says, on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. The word made literally means to cut, or even to destroy. So we might say that the Lord cut a covenant with Abram, and we'll come back later to see exactly what that means, saying, I give this land to your offspring from the brook of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hethites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. So God is making a covenant, cutting a covenant with Abram in chapter 15, beginning in verse 7. So let's go back to where we were. In verse 6, we had seen that Abram believed God and it was credited to his account for righteousness. In the very next verse, we begin to see the beginnings of this covenant that God is going to make with Abram. It says this in verse 7. He, God, also said to him, Abram, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. Abram said to God, Lord God, how can I know that I will possess it? And God said to him, bring me a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Well, at this point, Abram would know what's about to happen. At least he would know what he thinks is about to happen. He would know that he's about to enter a covenant. He's going to make a covenant with God. And a covenant is an agreement between two parties, but it's more serious than just a regular old agreement, and it has ramifications if you break the covenant. This could be a covenant just between two people, or it could be a covenant more between, let's say, a king and a subject, a lesser person. And in this case, we see some of the earmarks of a covenant between a sovereign, a king, and someone with whom that king or that sovereign might come into covenant with. This would be a person, for example, who would hold land under the sovereign. So I'm going to now hold this land. It's called a vassal. I'm a vassal. I'm going to hold a piece of land under the sovereign. And in return for me holding this piece of land, I pay homage to the sovereign, and I swear my allegiance to the sovereign. Well, in this type of a covenant, what would typically happen is the sovereign would say to the vassal, first, I will introduce myself. Here's who I am, and here's what I have done for you. And then the sovereign will lay out the terms of the covenant. Here is what you will do, vassal. And so let me give you an illustration here. Let me give you a covenant in Exodus chapter 19, covenant that God makes with Israel through Moses. And we will see that this order of events is exactly what happens. God says who he is, and then God lays out terms of the covenant. Let's look at what it says here in Exodus chapter 19, beginning in verse 3. We're skipping over to Exodus, but I'm doing this to show you what a typical covenant would look like between God the king and these people, Israel. Verse 3, Moses climbed the mountain to appear before God. The Lord called to him from the mountain and said, give these instructions to the family of Jacob, announce it to the descendants of Israel. Now watch what he says. God says this. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians. You know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. That is what God did for them. He is announcing, this is who is talking to you. This is who is about to enter into covenant with you. I am the Lord your God. These are the things I have done for you. Now we go to the terms. God says, now if you will obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my own special treasure from among the peoples, all the peoples on earth. For all the earth belongs to me, and you will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. God says to Moses, and he's saying this to the Israelites, if you will do this, I will do this. That's a covenant. God announces who he is and what he's done for them, and then God announces the terms of the covenant. You obey, and I'll come and do everything that I've said that I will do. That's typical. What we have in Genesis 15 is not typical. Notice at the beginning, we have the first part. God announces to Abram who he is and what he's done for him. I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. God says who he is and what he's done for Abram. But for the entire rest of chapter 15, there is not one term mentioned for Abram to fulfill. God does not say, okay, Abram, here are all the things you have to do, and if you'll do all these things, then I'll hold up my end of the bargain. He doesn't do that. There are no terms offered to Abram of stipulations of what Abram must do. Instead, verse 9, God says, bring me a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Now, Abram knows what to do with these things because he knows what the tradition of the cutting the covenant looks like. So here's what he does with these in verse 10. He brought these to him. He cut them in half and laid the pieces opposite each other, but he did not cut the birds in half. What Abram is doing here is setting the scene for the covenant to be ratified. He has these animals. He cuts the animal. He slaughters the animals. He cuts them in half, and he arranges the pieces, half over here and half over here. He has half of one animal here, the other half of that animal over here, half of another animal here, the other half of that animal here. And he lays them out on opposite sides of each other to make a path. So there is a path of blood running between these two pieces of animals. And to ratify the covenant, what they would do is they would walk between the pieces. So we make our agreement. This is what we're going to do. This is what this party's going to do. This is what this party's going to do. And they would walk this path between the pieces. And when they walked the path between the pieces, they were signifying, if I don't hold up my end, if I break the covenant, let me be like these pieces of animal. Let me be cut in two. Let me be destroyed. We call this cutting a covenant. And the one person would walk through and the other person would walk through. And then the covenant was ratified. If there was the king and the vassal that we talked about, sometimes the vassal would walk through only and the king would not walk through because he was above. And so Abram puts these animal pieces in this path and he waits for his next step. He's waiting on the Lord to say, okay, it's time, let's ratify our covenant. And Abram thinks the next step is that God is going to ask him to pass between the pieces. Meanwhile, verse 11, birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. Some people think that this is a symbolism of Egypt coming to take away the promise from Israel, and Abram is sort of driving them away and sort of in a figurative way, making sure that is not, Egypt will not once and for all take away the promises. They're only a mere annoyance in the grand scheme of things to the promises to Israel. Verse 12, as the sun was setting, a deep sleep came over Abram, and suddenly great terror and darkness descended on him. This, of course, is the presence of God. He is aware of the presence of God, and he is terrified by it. Verse 13, then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain. Abram said, how can I know? And God said, I'm going to cut a covenant with you. You can know for certain. Your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them, and they will be enslaved and oppressed. However, I will judge the nation they serve, and afterward they will go out with many possessions. But you will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of their Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Now verse 17, which is the most important verse in the entire story, and some even argue the most important verse in the entire Bible. It says, when the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking oven and a burning torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. A smoking oven and a burning torch appeared out of thin air and passed between the pieces. What in the world? First of all, a smoking oven and burning torch appear. That doesn't just happen. So this is a divine occurrence for sure. But it's more than that. It's God himself. And we know this because the word for smoking and the word for burning are the same words used of smoke and fire in the Exodus account, Exodus 19:18, where God descends on Mount Sinai. The same exact words for smoking and burning are the same exact words for smoke and fire when God descends on Mount Sinai in Exodus 19:18. The oven and the torch, odd, okay, but they have meaning as well. And I believe that the oven and the torch symbolize God's provision and salvation. First, provision, the oven. This would be like a portable, small, this is some translations, fire pot. This is a small, portable oven that you could bake. In particular, you would bake bread. And so this is the kind of oven that would be used, for example, in Leviticus for the grain offering, where people would take the grain and they would break it down into flour, and then they would knead cakes, and then they would bake it in the oven, and they would bring that for their grain offering. And what I want you to see there is that God is the one that provides the grain for them to go break down and make it into flour, to make it into cakes, to bring this offering. In other words, what we're saying here with the smoking oven, God's provision, God is saying, I have already provided everything necessary to make this covenant work. And then the torch. I believe the torch refers to God's salvation. In other words, it's righteousness. Most of the sources I read say that the torch represents judgment, and it might, and certainly it can, because there are references to torches used to burn things in a judgment sort of way. But here's why I say that it has to do with salvation and righteousness. In Isaiah chapter 62, it says the same word for the torch. Now the torch is not it's not a lantern. It's not, thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. That's a different word. It's not a lantern. It's a torch. Okay? And so this is the word that is used here in Isaiah 62. Listen to what it says. For Zion's sake I will not hold my peace, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest, until her righteousness, watch this, until her righteousness goes forth as brightness, and her salvation as a torch. That's the word. As a lamp or as a torch that burns. Watch this. The Gentiles shall see your righteousness, and all kings will see your glory. The torch, as God passes through the pieces, as a torch, it is his salvation, it is his righteousness. Abram is made righteous by God. We already saw that in verse 6. And will be a light, not only to the nation of Israel, but to the Gentiles. That God has done this thing, and we now are able to see that light of salvation and righteousness burns brightly for even the Gentiles to see. And now we too can come to the Lord. The oven and the torch, the smoking oven and the burning torch, is God moving between the pieces in what we call a theophany. Theophany. A theophany is where God appears, the invisible God appears in Scripture in a visible form. Abram sees God as a smoking oven and a burning torch. It's a theophany. It's the invisible God showing himself in a visible form. It's very important because we don't see that very often. And so we see it here. And so God passes between the pieces. And he never makes Abram pass between the pieces. He never gave Abram any demands. And he doesn't make Abram pass between the pieces. God is saying, every bit of this covenant is on me. And if I don't hold up the covenant, may I be like these pieces of cut in half animals. Fast forward a little over 2,100 years. The life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is already in the history books. And the author of Hebrews is attempting to describe the magnitude of what that means to us. And he puts it in terms of covenant. Quoting Jeremiah, who had prophesied a new covenant. The writer of Hebrews says this in Hebrews chapter 8, beginning in verse 8. The day is coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and Judah. This covenant will not be like the one I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and led them out of the land of Egypt. They did not remain faithful to my covenant, so I turned my back on them, says the Lord. He says, I'm making a new covenant. And it's not going to be like the one in Exodus 19 that I made with Moses and the Israelites. That was a bilateral covenant. I said to them, if you do this, I will do this. And they didn't do that, so now I don't have to do this anymore. They didn't keep up their end of the deal. But this new covenant is not like the one I made with Moses. It's a lot more like the one I made with Abram. It's unilateral. It's not bilateral. It's not if you do this, I will do this. The new covenant is this. I will put my laws in their minds. I will write them on their hearts. I will be their God. They don't have to do anything. They don't even need to teach their neighbors, nor will they need to teach their relatives. They don't need to teach their relatives saying, you should know the Lord. For everyone from the least to the greatest will know me already. And I will forgive their wickedness, and I will never again remember their sins. What's the basis of this covenant? How was this covenant ratified? It tells us in the next chapter of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 14 and 15. Christ offered himself to God as a perfect sacrifice for our sins. When you sin, there's already past tense a once and for all sacrifice. He is the one who mediates a new covenant between God and people. Jesus is the one who mediates the new covenant. He's the mediator. The word mediator means go between. Jesus is the go between. In eternity past, the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world, Father, Son, and Spirit make the decision to create, knowing that sin was inevitable. And the Son said, figuratively, I will go between the pieces. In this new covenant, if I, God, don't hold up my end of the covenant, I'll be cut to pieces. But of course, we know that's an impossibility. But if the human beings break their end of the covenant, I'll also be the one to be cut into pieces. And that's exactly what happened. Jesus was cut apart. When he acted out the covenant here on earth, in time and space, he himself became the pieces. And God ratified the covenant with us upon the sacrificial death of his Son, walking between the pieces of his own Son. And can it be that I should gain an interest in the Savior's blood? Died he for me, who caused his pain, for me, whom he to death pursued. Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, should die for me? Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, would go between the pieces for me?